learning to kind of strip your life back or your needs back to a kind of basic level, that you really reduce the things, not just to worry about, but the things you have to kind of factor into your life down to the kind of rawest elements. The only things you often have to think about when you're out in the wilds is like, what are you going to eat and when? Where will you get more water from? Where might you camp? What the weather is like, and how you're going to need to dress to deal with that weather.
Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. Today we're talking about something that is just a little bit different from what we normally talk about. Part of it is walking the length of the United Kingdom, which is a trip that's on my bucket list and just a great journey. But what makes it a little bit different is our guest today, Adam Lee, did the journey with his donkey named Martin. And so we're going to talk about all things walking and how to walk with the donkey. Hi, Adam. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Richard. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited. You probably get this question a lot, but what led to you walking 700 miles down the length of Britain? You know, what inspired you to do that trip? And then how did the donkey get involved?
So really, doing the trip across Britain was dependent on the donkey. It was a trip thought up to do with the donkey. And where it came from is a kind of few different reasons. Primarily, I got into doing long distance walking probably a bit more than 10 years ago. And one of the things I realized very quickly was that while I loved the walking, I love the outdoors, the camping, I love the idea of having everything that you need for your own survival on you and that feeling of self-reliance. I loved all of that, but I absolutely hated carrying all of the equipment in the backpack. And I tried to think of ways that you could get around having to carry the equipment yourself. I'd seen people who do kind of long distance walking where they like tow a little trailer behind them, but I felt that felt just a little bit too much like carrying it on your back, but just in a different way. And certainly, I thought the idea of like doing some ascents where you were dragging everything behind you just sounded as horrible as carrying it all on your back. I kind of was lying in my tent one night and I thought, well, maybe you could get a pack animal to do it. And I'd seen pack animals being used in Peru, and I'd also seen them being used in Morocco. And I thought, yeah, that sounds like it'd be a good way to not have to carry the equipment yourself. So that was the kind of the seed of where it came from. And then I have been a very big fan of doing what I would call like rough traveling or kind of slow traveling and camping, and kind of, lots of walking, hitchhiking, things like that. And I'd always done that abroad. So I was wondering what it would be like to travel like in that way through the UK. And then, so before I had the donkey, I did a walk where I walked from where I live in a city called Liverpool in the north of England. And I walked to where my mother lived in southwest Scotland. And this was all done without a donkey. This was just me carrying the stuff on my back. And one of the things that I particularly love about traveling is meeting people, having experiences where you meet people, you get chatting to them and then things like that. And none of that really happened when I did the walk across the UK. I met some people, but not many. And the reasons for that, I think, are twofold. Is one, I'm not particularly good at just striking up a conversation from nowhere with a stranger. I'm quite a chatty person once you get me in a conversation, but I find it difficult to be the person who would initiate that. So there was that, but then it was also that in the UK, I look a lot like most other people. I'm a white, middle-class white man in England, whereas when I've been abroad, I've looked more alien in the countries that I've been visiting. And so when I've been abroad, people have approached me and this kind of thing. So I thought to myself, I wonder if walking with a donkey in the UK would be the way that you would kind of be an opener to have those conversations and those experiences with people. So that was really the two reasons why I decided to get the donkey, why I decided to walk the length of Britain. I don't know. It was pretty arbitrary, to be honest with you. I wanted doing a long walk. Britain is, relatively speaking, not that big of a country. So although, 700 miles is a long way, it's not ridiculous, if that makes sense. It's not a ridiculous distance to walk. And so I just kind of decided that I would do that.
You mentioned this wasn't your first adventure. You'd done some slow travel before, and there was two trips when I was reading about you that were really interesting to me. One was a trip from New York to Tierra del Fuego. Can you maybe describe, what that trip was? I think you're hitchhiking along the way, and like, what's it like to do that type of trip?
Yeah, I mean, that was a trip of many different kind of like phases, I would say. My father is American, and as such, I have a US passport. My sister lives there in the USA, and I have lots of relatives there. So when I started that trip, I wanted to travel through Central and South America, and I had lots of family in the States. So I thought I'll just fly to New York, where my sister lives, and then I'll basically just like bum off my relatives and work my way down, broadly speaking, the eastern side of the states. So I did that. I went to a few different places, like I say, along the east coast of the states, and then from there I flew into Mexico and traveled down through Central America and into South America, and then, like you say, down to Tierra del Fuego, and then I did it back again. And really, for me, that trip, I was able to do that. I'd inherited some money. I'd been on a previous kind of traveling experience in Southeast Asia, which, although I really enjoyed it, it was a bit more like an extended holiday, and I wanted to do something that was to me more adventurous. And certainly, the purpose of going to Latin America was to do something more adventurous. And so I tried to kind of push myself to do things I'd not done before and go to places that were seemingly remote. And also, although I didn't kind of know it at the time, it was also a beginning of the kind of that philosophy of traveling slowly. So rather than flying from country to country, I tried to do the whole trip overland, either through hitchhiking or through buses or boats or stuff like that. And that's really where I cut my teeth in terms of the idea of kind of rough traveling and things like that. I traveled through the Mosquito Coast of Honduras and Nicaragua, which you have to do by a series of kind of boats through jungles and through swamps and things like that. And it's all like public transport. They're like shared collectivo boats that you share with local people. And we just kind of pieced this route together that took us along that kind of coast. And so I did that. I did lots of hitchhiking in Chile and Argentina. And also like lots of like multi-day treks in the mountains. So I did some walking in and around the name escapes me now, but in Peru, I did a route called the Alpamayo Base Camp Trek in Peru.
Okay,
Um,
up near the Wawash, near
yeah,
Juarez.
exactly. Spot on. Yeah. So I did that. I did a route called the Dientes de Navarino on Isla Navarino, which is like off the south coast of the continent, like south of Ushuaia. And yeah, those were really kind of those particular walks were ones was the first time I'd ever done any like multi-day treks in the mountains, and I was with a girl at the time who was quite a proficient walker and mountaineer, and so she was really able to enable me to do that. And we did that without guides. One of the places I saw pack animals being used was on that Alpamayo base camp trek. There were some Israelis that were doing the same route as us, and they'd hired a guy with mules. And I remember the particular memories of that walk where the mules really kind of stuck in my mind. There was one morning where my partner and I we made this porridge. It was so chewy that we couldn't eat it. And I remember like emptying it onto a rock and this mule coming and the mule eating the porridge and the mule being like, it was even too chewy for the mule. That memory really sticks in my head, and I think maybe that perhaps that was where the actual seed of the donkey was very, very first planted. But yeah, really, that was where I kind of cut my teeth. I would say in terms of the outdoorsy kind of adventuring, the rougher side of travel. That's really I did things on that trip aside from the places that we went to. I have this philosophy of like when you do a multi-day walks, any opportunity to not put the tent up is a win. And so I'm quite prone to sleeping in kind of abandoned buildings, or particularly that I learned on this this travel in like culverts under roads and stuff like that, and just adventurous places to sleep that mean you don't have to put the tent up. And so that all that kind of stuff was kind of learned on that trip across the Americas.
And then a few years later after that, you did another trip kind of more ambitious into Central Asia and the Pamir Highway. Do you want to talk about what led to that trip?
Sure, yeah. I mean, that trip really, that's where I discovered the joy of doing the long distance walking. That was my first, like, sustained long distance walk. And that trip was kind of born out of the trip in South America. My partner at the time when we were in South America often talked about where else we would like to go in the world. And in our quest to try and go off the beaten track, we kind of came up with the idea of going to Central Asia. And then basically life happened for 10 years, something like that. And I kind of didn't do it in that 10 years. I didn't do a lot of traveling. I didn't do a lot of like walking and camping and things like that. And then as I was getting back into it, I decided, I'd always wanted to go to Central Asia. And I was like, okay, well, now actually I'm at a point in my life where I've got the time and the money and I can actually go and do that trip. So I looked at the various things that I wanted to do in Central Asia. And the thing that I found I wanted to do the most was travel this road called the Pamir Highway. And the Pamir Highway is like a kind of 1,000-mile route that the Soviets built to be able to move things around that part of the world. And it runs from a town in northern Afghanistan called Mazar-e-Sharif. And then it runs through a bit of Afghanistan, through Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and finishes in a town called Osh. And I really wanted to do this route. And so I looked into the ways in which you could travel that route. The way most people do it, you do it as a tour. And tours are something generally that I'm kind of like philosophically opposed to doing when I go traveling. I like to experience these things for myself and not to kind of pay someone to show them to me. So I didn't really want to do the tour. And the tour particularly runs through the Tajik part of the Pamir Highway, which goes to this range of mountains called the Pamir Mountains. So I didn't want to do the tour. I thought about the idea of buying a four-wheel drive vehicle and driving that route myself. But, when I looked at it, it was like the route's about 1,000 miles. And actually 1,000 miles in a car is not really that far, if that makes sense. It sounds like a really long time, but, you could drive that in 10 days if you wanted to. And I just thought, well, if you drive it, it'd all be a bit over too quickly. And I had too many experiences of like driving myself or being on a train or on a bus, driving through a landscape and just thinking I would love to be out walking in that landscape and not seeing it out of this window. So I thought, no, not going to do driving. I considered cycling. And in Liverpool, where I live, I cycle around the city a lot, but I don't really like cycling for anything more than about 45 minutes, and then it starts to get uncomfortable. And I also hate cycling uphill. For me, that was just like the worst kind of cycling to do. And this route was going to do a couple of like 3,000 meter plus passes. And I just thought there is absolutely no way I'm prepared to cycle up those hills. That just sounds horrible. And so then really in my mind, that just left walking as the only final option. And so I decided I'd walk it. And like I say, I'd never done a big long distance walk like that before. I'd done multi-day treks, but I was looking where I was going to have to walk kind of like looking to walk between 20 and 30 miles a day realistically. And so I decided I'd just have to kind of like train myself up to do it. So I started like getting the train out from Liverpool where I live, and then walking back home from wherever the train took me to. And so I kind of got to the point where I wanted to be able to walk kind of 3 days back to back with a bag with all the equipment on me in terms of my kind of training schedule. So I did that, and then I went to do the walk. And I didn't do the stretch through Afghanistan. I decided that given the kind of political climate there, that was a risk too far. I mean, I'm into risk, if you know what I mean, but they have to be calculated, weighted risks. And I decided that for the sake of 40 kilometers, it didn't really seem a worthwhile risk. So I started at where the road enters Uzbekistan in a place called Termiz. And from there, through a combination of kind of a bit hitchhiking more at the beginning, when we were in the lowlands and it was like super, super hot, kind of 40 degrees by 11 a.m. in the morning. So I hitchhiked a bit of that. But then once I'd got into kind of Tajikistan, I walked the vast majority of the rest of the route, and particularly the bit through the Pamir Mountains, this kind of high altitude desert. I walked all of that, and that was one of the most amazing things I've ever done in my life.
And were you just walking like beside the road, or were there secondary routes you could take?
No, I followed the road, and the road kind of like changed in quality from place to place. So, at the start in Uzbekistan, it was like a proper tarmacked paved road. But once you got kind of further east in Tajikistan, and particularly up in the mountains, it was just like a kind of rubble track, if you know what I mean. And the thing is, it's like used by trucks and cars and things like that. But in the Pamir sections, just completely unpaved. But yeah, I followed the road. Yeah.
And was there a lot of traffic? Were you having to worry about vehicles, or was it just, so empty that that
It
wasn't a
was,
big concern.
no, I mean, I would say that, like, in the Pamir bit, which was easily the most remote bit, you might get 2 or 3 vehicles might pass you a day. And it was funny, quite often people would, like, pull up next to you, and they'd be like, "Where's your bicycle?" Because lots of people travel that road as a route to cycle from, like, Europe to China. So bicyclists, European bicyclists are fairly regular, and they'd be like, "Where's your bicycle?" And I'd say, "Oh no, I don't have a bicycle." And people are like, "What?" And you're like, "I'm walking the route," and they were just like totally like baffled by it. They were just like they couldn't
I've
believe
never
it.
heard of anyone walking that, and that actually is, it seems super cool.
No, I was gonna say they constantly offer you lifts, and then you say, "No, no, I'm fine, thank you, I'm fine. I'm just gonna keep walking." And they'd be like, "What the hell?" That just like they couldn't comprehend it. It was totally mad to them.
What would you do for resupplies? Like, would you go through a village on that isolated stretch? I imagine there weren't a ton of villages, so would you have to get a few
No,
days' food with you, or
yeah, I mean, I think if memory serves me correctly, I think that like there were two bits where you went for kind of like a week, 10 days between any kind of civilization. And so you'd have to buy enough food for that period. I mean, and this is where I'm talking about the back-breaking weight of the bag. You have to carry all that food. And I'd have like a big water bladder and I had like a water filter pump. So you only had to carry kind of water for the day, as it were. But yeah, you basically did these really long stretches between absolutely any kind of civilization. And I loved that. I would say those were probably some of my most favorite bits when you were like, you felt you were just really out there in the wilds, just you and the weight of the bag.
let's come back to the trip you did with Martin, your donkey, and for people who maybe aren't familiar with walking in Britain, I
Mhm.
always tell people it's like an undiscovered gem. You know, it's well
Yeah.
known in the UK, but the rest of the world, people don't realize how special it is. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the route and maybe some of the highlights, some of the places that for people who don't know anything and say, oh, they can go look on Wikipedia or find a YouTube video about some of these special places you walk through?
Yeah. So the route that I did, it started in a place called Cape Wrath, which is, if you imagine a map of Britain, Cape Wrath is the kind of top left-hand corner. Um, and at Cape Wrath, there is a lighthouse. And so I had to do like a day and a half, like walk in to get from the nearest road to the Cape Wrath lighthouse. And then from there, I walked down what we call the West Highlands of Britain. So they start in Cape Wrath, and I walked down to a place called Ullapool, and then from Ullapool, I walked further south, eventually to a place called Oban. And then from there, I walked from Oban through the kind of the really famous part of the West Highlands, which is a place called Glencoe, which is the kind of, if you imagine your fantasy image of what the Scottish Highlands looks like, you will almost certainly be imagining what Glencoe looks like. So I walked through this, and it's iconic. I mean, obviously, I would say if you wanted to go to Scotland, you should see Glencoe, but it's kind of like the Disneyland tourist attraction of the Highlands. So while it is stunningly beautiful, for me, there's crowds of people there. It's the atmosphere is not really what I'm after, but it is iconic, and definitely well worth the view. So I walked from there to Glasgow. And then I walked along the river that runs through Glasgow, the Clyde, to a place called New Lanark. And then unfortunately there, the donkey got ill. He got a problem with his hoof. And we had to get a lift to stay with my uncle, who is a farmer in Scotland, and stay with him for a month while the donkey recovered. And the donkey was very happy on the farm with the farrier, the kind of hoof doctor, coming to visit him and things like that. And then unfortunately, because of that, we kind of lost quite a lot of time. And so I ended up kind of skipping a bit out, where I got a lift with a horse box to a place called Kendal in the Lake District. And from there, we walked a lot of canals. For kind of international listeners, canals in Britain are these kind of watery roads that were made to transport goods all around the country in the kind of industrial revolution, and particularly useful for my purposes is they were designed to have these boats called narrow boats, which were pulled by horses. So by the edge of every canal in Britain is probably a 2 or 3 meter wide grassy verge that runs down the edge of the canal wherever the canals go. And the canals in their time were kind of like motorways or freeways, and they're all interconnected. So you could walk through a very large part of England entirely on canals. And these are perfect for walking with a donkey because they're purpose built for an equine to walk on. So we did a lot of canal walking. And then eventually around Bristol, we had to start walking on little back roads in England. And we walked through these back roads eventually to a place called Portland Bill, which is the place with another lighthouse on the south coast of England. And so it was a walk of a lot of variation. The bit in the Highlands was kind of very kind of mountainous and moorland walking. You know, we would do walk through glens. So you walk through the bottom of a valley and then you go up a mountain pass and then you drop down into the next glen, through to as you walk into Glasgow and around the River Clyde, kind of the quintessential British landscape that we all imagine, rolling green fields and trees and things like that, to the canals, which are kind of this weird mixture of, when they were in urban areas, they'd be quite dirty, kind of quite ignored places, whereas then they'd run through the countryside and they'd be like idyllic kind of rural rivers with kind of overhanging trees and things like that.
Now, logistics with a donkey have to be different, I'd assume, than just going by yourself. Like, did it impact where you'd stay each night and, how you'd get food for the donkey? Can you go to a Tesco and buy? I don't think you can. Or do they just eat grass? Like, you have to get supplemental feed for them?
No, so luckily Martin just eats grass, but he does eat a lot of it, and so you have to really kind of shape the day to meet his needs, and that the grazing is key. When we first started the walk, I was very much out of my depth. I didn't really know as much as I thought I knew about walking through a pretty challenging landscape with a donkey, and one of the things that was really difficult about it was at the beginning I didn't quite understand how much grass he needed to eat and how often he needed to eat it. So at the beginning of the walk, he was constantly wanting to eat, and I was just frustrated that we never seemed to get anywhere because all he ever seemed to want to do was eat. But as time went on, I really learned to kind of meet his needs, and by meeting his needs, he would then kind of want to do the things that I wanted to do. And grazing was key. So the kind of pattern that you have to follow is that, like, you'd have to stop about once an hour and let him graze for 15 or 20 minutes. And then once every few hours, you have to stop for an hour and let him really graze. And then you'd often take like an extended lunch break of like an hour and a half, and then repeat that pattern over the course of the day, the regular stopping and grazing. So that was just absolutely essential. And then things like camping, where we camped would often dictate quite a lot of the shape of the day as well. And what you need for camping in the perfect world, for Martin, you need like an enclosed field, so a field with a fence that goes all the way around it, and then you can just let him just free roam around that field and graze. You can't always rely on being able to find that, so often I would have to use like a tether for him, which is like a kind of, imagine like a screw with a big handle on the top, and you screw that into the ground and you tie the rope to that, and then he would graze on the tether overnight. And one of the key things to do first thing in the morning, as soon as I got up and got out of the tent, would be to move the tether so that he can then have a good breakfast graze while I have my breakfast and pack up the camp. So there was the option to tether him. In England, Britain is divided up into a number of countries and they all have slightly different laws. So in Scotland, you have no law of trespass, which basically means you can walk anywhere you want to in Scotland. And even though land is privately owned, landowners can't tell you not to walk on their land. You have the absolute right to walk where you want. And coupled with that right is that you have the absolute right to camp anywhere that you want to for up to 3 days. And so walking across Scotland with the donkey was absolutely fine. You could camp anywhere you wanted to, as long as you had grass. That was great. If he could be enclosed, great. If not, he could go on the tether. In England, that's more problematic because in England we do have laws of trespass and you can't just camp anywhere and you can't just walk anywhere. So we have lots of networks of what we call footpaths, which are public rights of way, which you can walk on if they're shown on the map. You have a thing called bridleways, which is where you can ride a horse on them, and there again they have right of way there, but you can't camp anywhere without permission. And so in England, when we walked on the canals, The canals are a kind of weird somewhere between public and private land. So to be honest with you, I just exploited what I perceived as that grey area and just camped on the towpath, on the path that goes down the side of the canal with the donkey. And I never had any problems doing that. And in fact, the people who run the canal network, the Canal and River Trust in England, quite a lot of their volunteers that I met along the way were all very supportive of me, both walking along the canal with the donkey and camping on the towpath. So yeah, that was okay. But then once you were off the towpaths, the camping was more problematic. And in the end, it wasn't very problematic at all, because what I would do is it'd get to about 7 o'clock in the evening, and I would just, with the donkey in hand, go and knock on a farmer's door and be like, "I'm walking with the donkey. Here he is. Don't suppose we can stay on your farm?" And I'm pleased to say nobody ever said no. And so often we ended up in the perfect situation where Martin would have a field to himself. I could camp there. Sometimes they'd invite you in for a meal, or they'd bring you some food out, or give you a drink, or something like that. So yeah, it was beautiful, really.
Oh, that's so nice to have. And you can connect and meet different people. That sounds like such a nice aspect of the trip.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you, like walking with the donkey, that experience is all about meeting people. I can tell you, if you walk in England with a donkey, people want to constantly ask you what's going on and have conversations with you and stuff like that. And what I found was that really it reveals the very best in humanity. I found that, like, my experience of it was that people want to be friendly, they want to be generous, and sometimes they just need an excuse. And the donkey is the perfect excuse for them to be friendly or generous, whether it be campsites. Quite often people would just buy you drinks in a pub. I did a little bit of collecting money for charity, and, people gave me loads of money for the charity and stuff like that. It was just like, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful, beautiful experience to just see this side of humanity that was facilitated by the donkey.
I was telling my kids about this, and they love the idea. They're like, we got to get a donkey for our walks in the Canadian Rockies, which
Yeah,
I
yeah.
found out it's not legal in the national
Is it
parks here in
not?
Canada.
Okay, yeah,
But they had two questions. And
sure.
I think I know the answer to one, but I don't know the answer to the other one. Their first question was, could you take Martin on the train home at the end of your walk? And
Unfortunately,
they talked about this forever. They just love this idea.
yeah, no, you can tell them. Unfortunately, I couldn't take him on the train on the way home. He's not opposed to going in buildings, but I'm not sure that he would get on a train. He certainly didn't want to get on a boat that I tried to entice him with. And so, no, in the end, to get home, what I have to do is basically kind of rent quite an expensive, like, horse taxi that we went in, which is just basically like a van with like a ramp on it, and he went in that, and it was funny to actually watch. I live basically almost exactly at the halfway point of the walk that I did in Liverpool, and when we got the horse taxi, basically what had taken me about 3 weeks to a month to walk, I just, in the taxi, we just undid it in about 3 hours. Which was a bit depressing to see how quickly you could do it in a car compared to how long it took me to walk it. Martin was very happy in the taxi, as it had both food and drink laid on for him, so he enjoyed that very much.
Their second question was, does Martin still stay with you? Does he live in your backyard? And
He
again, they love this idea of a donkey just in the
Yeah.
backyard. So
He doesn't live in my backyard. Unfortunately, my backyard is about a kind of like 5 meter square bit of concrete. And as we discussed, Martin needs an awful lot of grass to eat in order to live. So unfortunately, he doesn't live there. He lives on the farm where he originally came from. So when I decided I wanted to do the walking with Martin, I basically like Googled donkey farms Northwest England. And the first farm that came up, I got in touch with them and was like, I'd like to learn how to walk with a donkey. I went round, we had a chat. They thought I was mad, but they were like, okay, yeah. And so eventually they paired me up with Martin. I actually started with a different donkey and it didn't work out with that donkey. And then they paired me up again with Martin. And in fact, I got to name Martin once they paired me up with Martin. But when I did the walk, after a few months of training Martin, when I did the walk, he was basically loaned to me. And I realized very quickly categorically that this was going to be an enduring relationship that I would have with the donkey. That the relationship you have with the donkey, I discovered, is much like the relationship you have with a dog. So I don't know if you have a dog or if you ever have dogs, but it is a very personable relationship. It's a very affectionate relationship. They certainly know who you are, and you are kind of like the idea. A friend of mine who does this kind of thing described it as you are like their human. And so he definitely has this bond with me that he doesn't have with anybody else. And so what I realized as I developed this bond with Martin is that I was not going to give him up at the end of the walk. So when I finished the walk, I bought him, but he continues to live at the farm where he used to live. And that farm is about a kind of 20-minute drive from where I live. And so he lives there with his best pal, who is a horse, and they live together in a kind of like domestic bliss on the farm. And I go and visit Martin probably once every couple of weeks. And then every so often I go and do another walk with him. So just this year, I completed a route of about 200 miles called the Southern Upland Way, which runs from the east coast of Scotland to the west coast of Scotland, through the southern uplands, which is a range of mountains and hills that follows the border between England and Scotland. And so over the years, we've done a few walks together. But yeah, absolutely, I continue to maintain my relationship with him.
Professionally, you're a photographer and your work touches on long walks and rough travels. What can others learn from this type of travel?
I think, right, there's a few things that I learned about it. One, I think, is about a certain level of kind of letting go of worrying about how things are going to go and just leave yourself open to opportunity and experience. So, I mean, one of the things that I learned through during the walk with Martin was that we talked about camping earlier. For a long period at the beginning of the walk, I felt myself every day anxious about where we were going to camp each night because, Martin had these requirements and things like that. And I would spend a large portion of every day thinking and worrying about where we were going to camp. And then one day, about a month, 6 weeks into doing it, I thought to myself, you know what? You've worried about this every single day, and every single day you have found a good campsite. The evidence suggests you'll probably find a good campsite tonight. Stop worrying about it. And that was an incredibly freeing moment where, and I literally did stop worrying about it. And ever since then, I've not really worried about having a campsite. Don't get me wrong. Occasionally you find yourself at, 7 at night and it's starting to get dark and you've not found a campsite. And in that moment, I worry about finding a campsite. But in terms of spending time over the course of the day worrying about that, that just stopped happening. And I think there's a kind of lesson you can learn about that, about life in general, about kind of, don't worry about the things you can't control, and also engage in that process of being reflective about the experiences that you had and how those might well dictate how the experiences that you might have will go in the future. Yeah.
We worry
Um,
about so much and then it's like, oh, everything kind of works out. Maybe we don't need
yeah.
to
Yeah,
worry about
exactly.
100 things, only one or two things.
Yeah. So I think there's that. I was talking to someone about this recently. As well. I think learning to kind of strip your life back or your needs back to a kind of basic level, that you really reduce the things, not just to worry about, but the things you have to kind of factor into your life down to the kind of rawest elements, right? So, the kind of the only things you often have to think about when you're out in the wilds is what are you going to eat and when? Where will you get more water from? Where might you camp? What the weather is like, and how you're going to need to dress to deal with that weather. And that you kind of reduce your life down to those elements. And also, kind of within that is that thing of self-reliance, right? Of knowing that you've reduced yourself down to these basic things and your experience. And it sounds too extreme to say survival, because most of the time you're not in a survival situation, if you know what I mean. But nonetheless, your kind of well-being physically and mentally is all within your realm of kind of control within those things. And so I really like that idea of kind of shaving away all of the kind of the fat of life, as it were, and getting down to that rawness of those elements and being able to just be in charge of all of that and not have to worry about the other stuff. I don't know. I don't feel I'm explaining that very well, but definitely about kind of reducing life to its simplicities and feeling that feeling of self-reliance, if you know what I mean. That everything is down to me in this controlled kind of way.
Now, do you have a dream of like an ideal trip you'd want to do with Martin? Do you think, oh, you know, maybe not the Southern Uplands again, maybe there's a big trip or someplace.
My dream walk, well, it used to be one of the ideas for doing the walking with the donkey also came out of this idea when I was in Central Asia of like walking the Silk Road, walking from England to China along the Silk Roads. And I like the idea of doing that with a pack animal because it would kind of recreate that Silk Road experience. But over time, my girlfriend kind of persuaded me of a better walk to do, which would be to walk from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego down the western side of the Americas, and I'd like to do that with a pack animal or two. And I mean, the reason that I was persuaded by this by my girlfriend is that she said to me, if you were going to walk from Britain to China, think of all the different countries you'd have to walk through and all the different languages that are spoken in those countries. And she was like, if you were to walk from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, you'd basically need two languages, both of which, English and Spanish, you already speak. And certainly my experience of traveling is that the most heartwarming experiences you have are through conversations and interactions with people. And, when I went to Central Asia, I spent 4 months learning Russian. Before I went there, as because of the Soviets, that was a kind of unifying language of the region. And even after 4 months, my Russian was never really up to much. And so the conversations that you have would often be very kind of like basic. What do you do? What do your parents do? That kind of stuff. Whereas my experience of when I've done the rough traveling in England is because I speak English, you can get these really like much deeper level conversations and much more experience of interacting with people. And certainly when I did the Latin America trip, one of the best experiences I had was that hanging out with these guys in Guatemala City, and I had such an amazing experience with them is because they all spoke really good English, and so you have these depth of experiences, and I think that west coast of the Americas route would just be so much enhanced by the ability to speak both of those languages that it would make it a much more richer experience than doing the Silk Road. So that would definitely be my like fantasy walk. Who knows if that's ever possible? Who's to say?
It sounds absolutely epic. Adam, thanks for coming on the show today and sharing these adventures. It's so nice to hear, such unique adventures, from walking the Pamir Highway to walking the length of the UK with a donkey, and then these dreams of future great travels. I know I've really enjoyed hearing your stories.
Not at all. My pleasure. I mean, very, very happy to talk about them.
If people want to follow along and see what you're up to next, where can they find you?
I don't really use social media, so I don't really have any social media accounts. The best thing you could do is go to my blog, which is called Adam Walks. That's adamwalks.wordpress.com. And you can see some blogs there. But to be honest with you, I mean, I've not updated that for 7 years. I don't really have much of a kind of public profile, so to speak. But I have written a book about walking across the UK with Martin, and I'm currently in the process of trying to get that published. So I would say keep your eyes peeled for that if you want to know more about the ins and outs of walking across Britain with a donkey.
I can imagine it'll be a wonderful book. And when you get it published, it'd be great to have you back on the show and talk about it. Because I'm sure you have hundreds of stories. We've just scratched the surface. So I'll put links to Adam's dormant website, but there is some stuff on there you can check out. And with that, thanks everybody for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Bye-bye. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.